Greetings and welcome to Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation. To our members, friends, and everyone joining us in our virtual congregation on YouTube today.
Hello, I'm the Reverend Robin Landerman Zucker, minister of this congregation, and I will be hosting our virtual worship today on YouTube, January 17th, 2021, this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, with music from Rebecca Prizznick and Roomie Wood. One of our worship associates, Pia Driessen-Knittle, will offer our sermon today. It's entitled, I Am a German, but I Am Not a Nazi, a personal journey in anti-racism work. We're glad you're here and that you have made Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation part of this day in your spiritual life, whether you are a regular visitor or you are here for the first time. We're here every week on YouTube and we'll be at home at 510 North LaRue Street in Flagstaff as soon as it is safe to gather again in person. Our congregation is spiritually open and intentionally inclusive. Whoever you are and whomever you love, you are always welcome here, and we will joyfully marry you here as well. Our members and friends bring many interests, viewpoints, and theologies to our door. Here we trust you will find a common desire for meaningful community and spiritual growth and for relevant religious exploration in a framework with very flexible borders. Membership in this congregation is open to anyone who chooses to walk with us in the spirit of love, the search for truth, and the pursuit of justice. As I light our chalice, the symbol of our free faith, I invite you to light your own candle or chalice at home and join me in reciting the unison words you will see on your screen.
We light this chalice with a flame that draws us together. With this flame, we cut through the darkness of isolation and are warmed by the fires of our inner connection.
The mission and covenant of Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation express our values and our vision of ourselves as a gathered community in the world. Please join me in reciting the mission and covenant. You will see the words on your screen. The mission of Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation is to be a welcoming community that embraces diverse thought and belief and builds a just, peaceful, and compassionate world. Love is the spirit of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humanity in kindness, thus do we covenant. Our opening words today are by the Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd from her call to worship entitled, More Love. She writes, we are imprisoned by ifs and only ifs. We are confined by the smallness of our loving, even as our souls remind us that we can only get free if we are all free together. And so today, as we intersect in honest work, let our hopefulness mingle with our conviction. Let our willingness to love beyond our expectations or experience break down our long-held barriers. Let our willingness to be honest about the hardest questions open us to new truths. May there truly be more love, with no labels, no binary, and no preface, and no qualification, and no arithmetic, and no limit. May there be more love to liberate us all, and may we keep on today and every day until we find it and share it inch by precious inch with one another and the world.
Please join me in singing Lift Every Voice and Sing. past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Now is the time in our service when members and friends are invited to share a personal joy or sorrow in the supportive fellowship of this community. If you have a joy or sorrow you'd like me to share, please email it to me by Thursday at minister@beaconuu.com. Each week, we also have a live post-service gathering on Zoom, and you can find the links for those in our e-news on our website. That's at 11 a.m. on Sundays, when we also pause to share joys and sorrows in real time. Last week, I held up this Hope Stone, something that was part of our sanctuary care packages. It was the only stone I put in after a really difficult week in this country and world after the uprising and violence at the US Capitol. It's been another week of intense activity in our country and concern about the inauguration next Wednesday of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So once again, I put in this Hope Stone in hope that there is not tremendous violence next week and that we can move into a new chapter, perhaps trying to unify us across very, very broad beliefs and hopes that people have for this country. So this is a stone of hope for everyone. For all of those who are on the front lines of fighting the coronavirus, now that there has been a large spike here in Arizona and around the country and world, this stone is for you. We are with you. We hold you in love and light, and we send you all the best to remain healthy as you fight this virus. For everyone who has a family member or a close friend or who may themselves be suffering from COVID, again, we send you love and light. And if you are in Flagstaff and there are practical ways we can be of help to you, please reach out to us. Again, minister@beaconuu.com. We are with you. To all those in this country who hold the line against racism, against violence, against all of the ways in which folks are cruel to one another rather than coming together, this stone is for you. Let us try to move forward peacefully to create unity and understanding across differences. And for all the joys and sorrows that remain unspoken because they are either too tender or too private to share, let us remember that everyone is fighting their own private battle. We know not what it is, but because we're human, we know it to be true. So let us be kind, compassionate, flexible, and forgiving with one another. And now we will pause for you to speak your joys and sorrows privately into the silence. I'd like to invite you now into that space in our service that is contemplative and enables you to engage in some intentional breathing. Really feel how that breath supports you, creates spaciousness in you for all the things I just mentioned: kindness, compassion, flexibility, forgiveness, and self-care, particularly at this time. So if you're willing, close your eyes, uncross your arms and your legs, put your feet flat on the floor, and just breathe. Just breathe. 4 beats in intentionally and slowly through your nose, 5 or 6 beats out through your mouth. We'll just breathe together. See how you can create that spaciousness starting at the crown of your head, moving down a sort of axis in the middle of your body to the soles of your feet. See if you can create spaciousness and openness in your arms, in your torso, in your legs, in your throat, in your face, in your crown. And let's just breathe. As you continue breathing, I offer these words by Mason Bolton. Breathe for yourself, for each other. Let us breathe in when others cannot. When we can do nothing else, let us stretch ourselves open to embrace our friends, extend our bodies outward to anyone willing to meet us, and even those we think may not be willing. Let us hold each other for this moment, for this blink of human existence. Breathe for yourself, for each other. Let us breathe in when others cannot. Let us continue our breathing into our musical breathing meditation.
Our reading is an excerpt from the letter from a Birmingham jail written by Martin Luther King on April 16, 1963. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed. With all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured.
I will battle at the side of my brother.
My sermon is entitled, I Am German, but I'm Not a Nazi, My Personal Journey in Anti-Racism Work. A few months ago, Reverend Robin asked me if I was interested in giving a sermon on my involvement in anti-racism movement. I happily agreed because this is something close to my heart. And I thought I could just recycle the sermon I gave a few years back with Reverend Janino. After thinking about it for a while and talking with Reverend Robin, I realized that this needs to go beyond that Sunday of a couple of years ago. In fact, it must go much farther back than even I realized. This will not be a lecture on how to be an anti-racist, but rather a reflection of the path that I took. I grew up in Germany. I was born 16 years after the end of World War II. At the end of the war, the Allies forced Germans to confront the atrocities inflicted by Germany during the war. Later, the Third Reich became an integral part of school curriculums and popular culture through TV, movies, and books. It was impossible not to learn about our history. And it affected me profoundly and would eventually lead to where I am today. Germany in the 60s and 70s was a very homogeneous country. Towards the end of the 60s, guest workers from Southern Europe, mainly Turkey, Spain, Italy, and Greece, entered the country. At first, it was mainly men who came, and as a child, I had little to no contact with them. But with the arrival of guest workers, Germany's population grew more diverse. I grew up in a small community south of Frankfurt with a population of about 5,000. Many German World War II refugees from Eastern Europe, an area that is now Poland, had settled in the same neighborhood that my family moved into. We were also not originally from that area, a fact that was made clear to us children repeatedly by the locals. So looking back, I grew up with the sense of not belonging, which I suppose made me sensitive and ultimately set the stage for what I would be doing in the future. I am neither Black nor brown, have no personal experience with racism, and do not pretend to know what it feels like. However, I do know what it feels like to be stereotyped and excluded due solely to my German heritage. While in high school, I started to travel extensively throughout Europe. In college, I majored in historical ethnology, and my interests and love for different cultures fueled my desires for travel and to meet people from around the world. In the late 70s, the fact that I was from Germany traveled with me everywhere. I remember visiting a friend in northern France. He was taking me to visit a citadel. And as he bought our tickets, he asked me to remain quiet because he was afraid that if the cashier would hear that I was German, we would not be sold any tickets. In 1982, I started my exchange year at the University of Arizona. Once again, I was confronted with Germany's past when a professor singled me out and told the class that all Germans were militaristic and aggressive. My classmates asked me to report him to the dean, which I declined to do. It did leave me, though, with a strange feeling, a mixture of hurt, embarrassment, and annoyance. Even years later, after I started working at NAU, I continued to be confronted with Germany's past. Co-workers calling me and another German co-worker Nazis, in jest, they said, or making references to TV shows depicting stereotypical Germans. Before NAU, I worked at Coconino High School in Flagstaff in the counseling office. More than 50% of the student body was either Native American, Hispanic, or African American. And I saw firsthand the struggles these students and their families faced. During that time, I was a staff advisor for Grand Canyon Youth, a local organization bringing youth to experience the Grand Canyon and Colorado River. At Coconino, we were primarily trying to encourage underrepresented youth to participate. One year, we had a group from inner city Philadelphia join our local students on a river trip. For most of the students, it was an experience of a lifetime. It had opened a world to them that was previously closed. During the same time, my daughter and I were members of the Flagstaff Stingrays swim team. The focus of the Stingrays was not only to get minority youth off the street, teach them how to swim, but also, through physical activity, allow them to develop a different outlook on life. J.T. Francis, a local African-American man and the president of the Stingrays, had received grant funding for the team. It was an eye-opening experience for Inka and I, being members of a team that largely consisted of youth of color, when most of the other swim teams we encountered at meets were 100% white. I learned that many kids of color never learn how to swim and are disproportionately affected by drowning. This was white privilege at work. Once I started working at NAU, I learned more about white privilege. I saw it all around me without at first realizing what it was. Once I did, I had to face the role I was playing in it. In White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo says, quote, "Part of the power differential is that white people have the choice, the power to ignore race and racism. I can choose not to talk about race. Not so for people of color, who can't escape knowing what life looks like in white land," end quote. For the UU perspective, listen to Dr. Takia Noor Amin words, a member of the Black Lives of UU Leadership Collective. She said, "My deep sadness as a Unitarian Universalist is that while this faith community has always been a space that welcomed my varied religious heritage, my Blackness hasn't always felt at home here. That is to say, I have never been able to take for granted that I would be welcome in UU spaces as a Black woman. No matter how long I've been a member, what committees I've served on, or the number of times I've been a GA delegate, I've never been able to take for granted the sense of home and welcome and connection that I see my white UU siblings proudly proclaim," end quote. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh, Associate Director of the Wellesley College Center of Research, published an article called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. In her article, she says, as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, as which puts me at an advantage. She continues, I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Describing white privilege makes one newly accountable. So who writes about white privilege must ask, having described it, what will I do to lessen or end it? End quote. What am I? What are we going to do about it? I have been extremely lucky over the years. I was fortunate enough to develop close relationships with some of my students of color who shared their experience at NAU and in Flagstaff with me. I think because of my own background, I was able to relate to them. I encouraged them to speak out about those experiences. When I shared some of what they told me with some Beacon friends, I was met with this belief that this was happening in Flagstaff. Microaggressions and racial slurs are real in our mountain town. And it's not limited to African American people, but all people of color are subject to that. One day, one of my Hispanic accounting students approached me and shared a comment a professor had made to him in front of the class. When he had gotten an A on a difficult exam, the professor loudly proclaimed that he was surprised that he was able to get such a good grade. It was clear to the student that the professor made the comment in response to the student's ethnic background. Allyship starts with listening and acknowledging those realities. I think it is in our nature to react by saying something like, the professor didn't mean it like that. However, we must make sure that our neighbors of color are heard and not to minimize their experiences. They might seem trivial to us, but continued put-downs not only create a culture of mistrust, but it excludes our neighbors from our society. Over the years, I learned more about white privilege, white supremacy, and anti-racism. I presented to academic advisors at NAU and CCC when there were very few advisors of color, and white privilege and anti-racism had not become part of our everyday vocabulary. I spoke at Beacon, as mentioned earlier, and participated in a teach-in through UUA at Beacon 2 years ago. I sang with the gospel choir at NAU and learned about Antigone and Ferguson, a theater of war production in which Sophocles' Antigone is connected to Michael Brown's killing by police in Ferguson, Missouri. I read books, talked to people, friends, students, watched movies, participated in discussion groups, and I listened to podcasts. There are so many resources available. Anti-racism work is not about self-flagellation, but instead about self-reflection. We are all products of our socialization and need to take time to understand our role in white privilege and white supremacy. Going back to the experience with the Stingray swim team, how would you react when you hear that African American children ages 11 to 12 are 10 times more likely to drown than their white counterparts? Is this a form of racism? How about the fact that Americans of color die at a higher rate of COVID-19 than white Americans? Is the lack of appropriate access to health care a form of racism? What are we going to do about those facts? Do we shrug our shoulders, continue on, or do we feel outrage? If we do feel outrage, what will we do with it? Will we proclaim allyship, put on Black Lives Matter t-shirts and march? Or do we get involved and try to change the policies that make people of color into second-class citizens? To change policies, we must first understand what they are built on, who built them, and who benefits. Only then, when we understand the role we are playing in systemic racism, will we be able to institute change. A great example is the recent name change of Agassiz Street in Flagstaff. I first learned about Louis Agassiz when the Black Student Union petitioned NAU to change the name of a conference room in NAU's Du Bois Center. Not only were the students able to change the name from Agassiz to Thurgood Marshall Room, but it started the discussion on the city level as well. In 2020, Agassiz Street here in Flagstaff was changed to W.C. Riles Street. And W.C. Riles was a Black educator here in the city and in California as well. The Agassiz discussion stirred up some very uncomfortable emotions, but discovering one's history is not about being comfortable. It is a critical part, though, of anti-racism work. It is easy to march, and it is much harder to understand and accept what has been done in the name of one's country. I'm German. I know the feeling and have been living with it all my life. According to Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says, the opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. The only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. To understand it, you must know the history of it. He continues, the common idea of claiming color blindness is akin to the notion of being not racist. As with the not racist, the colorblind individual, by ostensibly failing to see race, fails to see racism and falls into racist passivity. In a PBS NewsHour interview on January 7th of this year, Kendi said, what we saw at the US Capitol is part of us. It is what we are. It is not all of us, but it is part of us. It is part of America. There is a long history of white domestic terror laying siege on American democracy, and we have to own that and accept that, because that is the only way we can rid this country of it. I have been fortunate over the years to be reminded of my role as a white middle-class woman. I have privileges that allow me to speak up, like today. I've been exposed to so many experiences that sharpened my view and sensibilities. I've only been able to vote in 2 elections so far, a right that did not come easily and that I will pursue responsibly. We can all make a difference, even if you cannot vote. You can write letters to the editor about injustice you observed. You can discuss racial issues with your family and friends. Speak out when you hear comments that are racially insensitive. Educate yourself by reading books, maybe including them in your book club. Take classes. Coursera offers free classes online. Watch movies or listen to podcasts. Or take the implicit bias test through Project Implicit, Harvard University. Watch the excellent discussions on lived Black experience through the local Murdoch Community Center YouTube channel. Anti-racism work is not easy work, but it is important work that aligns with our UU principles. Be open to being uncomfortable, embrace it. See it like the COVID-19 vaccination. If it hurts after getting it, it means that it is working.
Please join me in singing We Are a Gentle, Angry People. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
The spirit of generosity and gratitude flows through Beacon Unitarian Universalist congregation. Each week in our service, whether we're here in our sanctuary or here in our YouTube sanctuary, we take an offering to support Beacon and our programs. There are 2 ways for you to donate. You can go to our website, beaconuu.com, find the donate button, and make a secure online donation through the Vanco application. Please use a bank account rather than a credit card if you're going to use this method, as it will enable us to avoid some fees and have more to support Beacon. Or you can send a check to us here at 510 North LaRue Street in Flagstaff, Arizona, 86001. Either way, we so appreciate your generosity during this challenging time when some of our income sources simply are not available to us because of the pandemic and the limitations it has brought. So thank you very much for your donation of any amount. It's our custom to come together at the end of our service, join hands here in the sanctuary, and really feel the warmth, the connection, and the power of this congregation. So I invite you to imagine yourself doing that virtually, being here in a circle, holding hands, and feeling, really feeling deeply that whether we are together or apart, we are Beacon, always connected. Please reach out to me if there is a way that I can help you feel more connected to Beacon at this time, or help you in some way move through this challenging time. In her sermon, Pia mentioned the Murdoch Center here in Flagstaff, Arizona. You can find them on Facebook and on YouTube with both live and recorded discussions on race of various topics. That's MURDOCH Center here in Flagstaff. And also on our website, I compiled back in August some anti-racism resources that you can access to learn more about this topic and ways to actively become anti-racist in your life and your community. It is Martin Luther King weekend. And as closing words, I offer this excerpt from his sermon entitled The Drum Major's Instinct. It was given by him on February 4th, 1968 at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Atlanta congregation that was led by his father and is currently served by the Reverend Gabriel Warnock, the newest senator from Georgia. The Reverend King concludes his sermon this way. He says, somewhat in a prescient way, given his assassination not that long after, if any of you are around when I have met my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then, I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school or my degrees. I'd like someone to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be on the right side of the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were imprisoned. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve all humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace, that I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind in love, in justice, and in truth, and in commitment to others, so that we can make of this old world a new world. Timeless words from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Now, more than ever, as we wish to make the old world a new world, may we make it so. Blessed be, blessed we, and amen.